correct me if I'm wrong, but you try to match companies and philanthropists, et cetera, to the water sector. How is this change, or is this thinking, it's probably a hard sell. How's it going?
The work that is done, for example, by Water for People and some of the other groups that are kind of forward-thinking, it's demonstrated in the work that they're doing. And so it's not as hard of a sell as we imagine. When we go through kind of the matching process or going through, to identify some of the groups that are really doing some great work, one thing that's extremely key for us is to really know what everybody is doing out there so that we can provide, as best informed information as possible. And so I think that that's one of the things, at Water Advocates we're trying to do, but it's not, it's not as hard of a sell. I think that this is the direction that a lot of corporations and foundations and are going in, and they see it's not only them, but it's kind of a little bit of everybody's taken on that role to really do effective work versus counting the numbers.
A climate conference coming up in China, second week in October. How do we get water on the agenda so that that actually starts to figure into the calculations when we're looking at where to fund it, where to build, and what to build and how?
And I think most of the people that are working on resolutions have seen that these sort of global peace talks that had produced the peace accord in Sudan a few years ago were really in the aftermath of conversations that were happening at the local level on how water resources are managed. And they couldn't have succeeded had there not been these other more localized discussions about water and security. So it's a very good point. There's a very powerful interlinkage there.
But it opens up some huge questions for NGOs, for advocates, for disaster response when you're talking about a big shift from huge areas to urbanized areas.
I think that my community, the sort of the international disaster response community, is not very well prepared to deal with cities.
The end user or the ultimate recipient of what we're trying to achieve, it doesn't really matter where they come from.
I do think that I totally agree with what you're saying. I think there's a tendency to focus on urban or rural. I think you're absolutely right that it's a very fluid situation. There's a lot of issues around tenancy and land ownership and all that in urban areas that really influence how people can access water and sanitation. A lot of landlords couldn't care less. Or we're finding a lot of landlords, when they end up buying, investing in latrines, actually up the rent, and so you see a change in ownership. But small towns are generally neglected. They're really kind of lost in this shuffle a little bit. And small towns are actually, in some senses, some of the harder ones to work in because the capacity there is quite weak. The economics of small towns sometimes isn't exactly clear, and I think it's really where people are hedging their bets. They're really got one foot in a small town and one foot in the rural areas. Their infrastructure is extremely old and decaying. It's overburdened, and I think there's a tendency to see over that, and so.